Am I audible? Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, from Hall B, I am Dr. Arvind Kumar. I welcome you all. This session we have 6 speakers and we invite our chairpersons, Dr. Vinit Kumar, Dr. Nishant Tripathi, Dr. Sunil Kumar, Uma Shankar Prasad, Dr. Sudhir Chandra Jha, Dr. Bibi Bharti, Dr. KK Lohani, Ravi Kirti, M. Thakur, Santanu Ghosh, and SK Madhukar. Those who have joined, please stay with us. Now I hand over mic to Dr. Vinit Kumar, our intervention cardiologist, to introduce the first speaker and start the proceeding. Dr. Vinit Kumar.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Now we'll welcome my head and unit chief, Dr. A. George Kosi. He is a MD-DM, and only one word I just want to introduce. He is the best teacher I've seen. So he need not need any more introduction. Just welcome Dr. A. George Kosi. It's always honor to listen him. Definitely we are enjoying your talk every time. And
तो मेरे से क्यों गुस्सा है?
Formerly he was head and professor, Department of Cardiology, Government Medical College, Trivandrum. Hand over to sir.
I will share my screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Just a start, sir.
My screen is visible?
Yes, sir. Yes. It's visible, well visible.
Okay. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to CSI Bihar chapter for this kind invitation. I consider it a privilege and it's an honor. And I'm very happy that Dr. Vinit is here. We were together for 3 years and it was a wonderful experience. I'll be speaking on new pathways in the management of heart failure. We know that there are 3 important pathways in heart failure: the sympathetic nervous system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and the natriuretic peptide system. We have the beta blockers acting on the sympathetic nervous system, the ACE inhibitors, the ARBs, and the MRA acting on the RAS, and now we have the sacubitril along with the ARB, which acts on both the RAS as well as the natriuretic peptide system. So all the 3 important pathways, we have drugs now available. We know that heart failure is a progressive disease with deterioration of the cardiac function and quality of life. And the progressive cardiac injury leads to worsening myocardial dysfunction. And that is why we say that the phrase stable heart failure is actually a misnomer. Any patient with heart failure has significant residual risk for hospitalization or sudden cardiac death, even when they are minimally symptomatic or even asymptomatic. But success in failure. So look at the data. Without proper medical management, 2-year mortality of heart failure is 35%. You can reduce it to 25% with ARNI. Further reduction is possible with beta blocker. You can bring it down to 16%, and with triple therapy. We call it triple therapy, meaning ARNI with beta blocker with an MRA. You can reduce the mortality to 11.5%. So from 35%, you bring it down to 11.5%. We used to say that triple therapy reduces mortality to 1/3. But now we have something more, the SGLT2 inhibitor, further reduction, and we have achieved a mortality reduction less than 10%. And that is the paradigm HF trial, which we have discussed many times, comparing the ARNI with enalapril, the cardiovascular mortality and hospitalization for heart failure significantly reduced. And we know the ARNI, it's a combination of sacubitril with valsartan, and sacubitril enhances the cyclic GMP-mediated effects of the natriuretic peptide. So you have all the advantages, vasodilatation, and a lot of other benefits which have been shown there. And valsartan suppresses the RAS-mediated effect, the vasoconstriction, salt and water retention, the aldosterone secretion, cardiac fibrosis, and things like that. And one important point is when you take ARNI and the mode of death, the total mortality is reduced by 20%. Sudden cardiac death is reduced by 20%. Worsening heart failure reduced by 20%. Cardiovascular mortality reduced by 20%. And the overall mortality is also significantly reduced. And that is a very robust data. Now, NT-proBNP is very important. It's a very important biomarker in heart failure. Now we know that 30-day NT-proBNP, if you can bring it below 1000 picogram per ml, it is very good. The mortality will be significantly less, as is shown by that red line. Whereas you cannot achieve an NT-proBNP less than 1000, then the mortality continues to be high. So 30-day NT-proBNP is significantly reduced by ARNI in the paradigm heart failure trial, which has subsequently been proven. You have the PROVE-HF trial, rapid and significant reduction in NT-proBNP was observed. And it is interesting to note that the majority of reduction happened in the first 2 weeks. Look at that. It has come down from 800 to something like 500 in 2 weeks' time. So that is very interesting. And you take any patient group, ARNI is superior to ACE inhibitor. Age, ejection fraction, EGFR, systolic blood pressure, even people with lower NT-proBNP, higher NT-proBNP, there is a distinct benefit. So ultimately, we have to agree that the ARNI is going to replace ACE inhibitor and ARB. That is my point. The only issue is the cost factor. And when ARNI becomes generic, I am very sure that it will replace the ACE inhibitor and ARB. Those drugs will become historically important, maybe in the next 5 years. We have the PROVE-HF trial, ARNI and reverse remodeling. You look at any parameter, left ventricular ejection fraction, left ventricular end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, left atrial volume index, and the very important diastolic parameter, E by E prime. So everything is significantly reduced by ARNI compared to ACE inhibitor or ARB. So when you have ARNI available, why should you prescribe ACE inhibitor and ARB? We have some data of ARNI in acute heart failure. Pioneer trial, where it was initiated between 24 hours and 10 days. And they looked at death, heart failure, rehospitalization, LVAD, and transplant distinct. Significant reduction, 16.8% with enalapril and just 9.3% with ARNI. And now coming to eplerenone, we are quite familiar with this molecule. It reduces mortality, acute MI complicated by LV dysfunction and heart failure. The FSS trial, 15% reduction. If you take systolic heart failure and mild symptoms, emphasis HF trial, there is a significant reduction in mortality. But what we are more interested, look at the reminder trial. Early eplerenone treatment in patients with acute STEMI without heart failure. This is without heart failure. What did they find? There is a significant reduction in the primary endpoint in the group which received eplerenone. So addition of eplerenone to standard therapy within 24 hours of symptom onset improves the outcome of patients presenting with acute STEMI without evidence of heart failure and without the LVEF below 40%. So even if the EF is above 40%, even if there's no heart failure, there is a benefit with eplerenone. And SGLT2 inhibitor is the new addition. 3 important aspects: improvement in the ventricular loading, reduces preload, reduces afterload, improvement in the myocardial energetics, ketosis, very, very important, increase in the hemoglobin and hematocrit because of the increased EPO protection. And also, it has an action of inhibition of the cardiac SGLT2-1 and the NHE1, leading to improved cardiac calcium handling. And we also know this promotes improved glycemic control and weight loss. So this is emerging as a very useful drug in heart failure. And we know the DAPA-HF, dapagliflozin, significant reduction in the worsening heart failure and cardiovascular mortality. And the point is, irrespective of whether they are diabetic or not, the benefit is almost the same. 25% reduction in people with diabetes and 27% reduction in the primary endpoint in people without diabetes. So whether there is diabetes or not is not really very important. It is nothing specific for dapagliflozin. It has been observed for empagliflozin also. The EMPEROR reduced trial, reduction in all-cause mortality or worsening of heart failure, and it is evident very early. You don't have to wait for a long time. It is evident from day 12 in patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction. And this is the EMPEROR response acute heart failure trial. Acute heart failure, there is some data, small data, 80 patients, empagliflozin 10 milligram versus placebo. And look at very impressive data. Risk reduction of worsening heart failure, death of heart failure readmission at day 30, at day 60. That black bar is the placebo and the blue bar is the empagliflozin. And serious kidney events with empagliflozin versus placebo. Significant renal protection with the SGLT2 inhibitor. In addition to the ACE inhibitor or ARB, this is the only other drug which offers renal protection, reducing proteinuria. And if you look at this data, you find that in the EMPA group, end-stage kidney disease or sustained profound decrease in eGFR occurred only in 1.6% of the patients, whereas it occurred in 3.1% of patients without EMPA in the placebo group. So significant renal protection, which is not offered by most of the other drugs. Then people may tell that, okay, the benefit with the SGLT2 inhibitor is not much, but it is not like that. See, look at the number needed to treat. Cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure outcome in the recent major heart failure with reduced ejection fraction studies. In the PARADIGM-HF trial, the number needed to treat is 22. Whereas you take the SGLT2 trial, in DAPA-HF it is 21. In the EMPEROR reduced, it is 19. So SGLT2 inhibitors are not inferior drugs. They are at par or even maybe even marginally better than ARNI, if you look at that very critically. And significant other benefit. So here we have a drug which does not produce electrolyte abnormality. All other drugs used in heart failure, other than beta blocker, produce significant electrolyte problem. So there's no risk of hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, hyponatremia, and no issue of hypochloremic alkalosis, nothing. So it's a very good drug from that angle. And various other advantages. Ordinarily, it does not lead to hypotension. And to look at the dosing characteristic, once daily dose, single dose, titration of dose. With most of the drugs, you know, once daily, even if it is once daily, dose titration will be required. You start with a small dose, then you slowly step up the dose and then achieve the maximum dose, which is used in the clinical trials. But here you have the SGLT2 inhibitor, both dapagliflozin and empagliflozin, 10 milligram, single dose, once daily, no dose titration. So much of convenience, and the drug does not produce significant hypotension. And that is reflected in the guideline, the 2021 update published in JACC, the expert consensus decision pathway for optimization of heart failure treatment. Stage C, heart failure. What is stage C? Stage A is someone with risk factors like hypertension, diabetes. Stage B is someone with a structural abnormality like left ventricular hypertrophy or post-MI status, but still asymptomatic. Stage C is a patient who has symptoms. So the recommendation, ARNI, ACE inhibitor of ARB with an evidence-based beta blocker. Evidence-based beta blocker is metoprolol succinate or bisoprolol or carbidopa with diuretic if required. And after that, if the eGFR is more than 30, you can add an aldosterone antagonist. So they are on triple drug. And look at the yellow thing. For patients meeting the eGFR criteria, NYHA class 2 to 4, you add an SGLT2 inhibitor. And always remember, in patients who are in sinus rhythm, who continue to have a heart rate above 70 on maximally tolerated beta blocker, you can always add ivabradine 5 milligram BID or 10 milligram OD on the sustained release formulation. Hydralazine isosobate dinitrate in people with CKD and people who cannot be prescribed the other drugs. And the important question in a patient with new onset stage C heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, whether to initiate a beta blocker or an inhibitor of the RAS first. In some cases, both can be started together. Initiation of an ARNI or ACE inhibitor is often better tolerated when the patient is still congested. So someone who is wet, you give RAS blockade. Someone who is dry with tachycardia, you give beta blocker. But beta blocker should not be initiated in patients with decompensated signs or symptoms. And this is something coming up recently, initially proposed by Packer and McMurray, the rapid sequencing algorithm. So step 1, you give beta blocker with SGLT2 inhibitor, not ACE inhibitor or ARNI. Step 2, you add an ARNI. Step 3, you add an MRA like eplerenone. And the very important thing, all 3 steps to be achieved within 4 weeks. So at the end of 4 weeks, people are on all the 4 drugs, which is called the foundational therapy or the MIGHTY4. So MIGHTY4 at the end of 4 weeks. Step 1 is beta blocker with SGLT2 inhibitor. And the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, the recent guideline 2021, they call it the foundational therapy of the MIGHTY4. All 4 foundational therapy classes should be trialed before routine addition of personalized therapy. And next sentence, very important. Initiate first, then titrate. Initiate all 4 foundational therapies should be attempted before dose titration. So in the initial 4 weeks, you give the MIGHTY4, then you step up and do the dose titration. And if you look at that, 1-year mortality can be brought down from 17% to 4.7% with foundational therapy. And in people with sinus rhythm, if you add ivabradine, maybe you can bring it down even to 4.2%. And there are some advantages for simultaneous initiation of beta blocker and SGLT2 inhibitor. Beta blocker most effective and rapidly acting option to prevent sudden cardiac death. Most likely to benefit ventricular remodeling in long-term treatment, but it may produce fluid retention and early worsening of heart failure. But if you combine beta blocker with SGLT2 inhibitor, then you may not have to give much diuretic. Early osmotic diuresis rapid reduction in risk of heart failure worsening, and renal protection. There's no decline in renal function, whereas that could be an issue in people with high creatinine and all that. You cannot give the RAS blockade, and does not require specialized safety monitoring. No electrolyte issue, no laboratory testing is required, and initiated a therapeutic dose without requiring dose titration. So who should receive SGLT2 inhibitor ahead of ARNI or ACE inhibitor or ARB? Maybe everyone, we don't know, but at least 3 group of people. Number one, those with borderline blood pressure. You are scared to give ARNI or ACE inhibitor. Number 2, borderline renal function and risk of acute renal worsening. And number 3, when there is significant risk of hyperkalemia. So these 3 situations, at least, SGLT2 inhibitor should be used ahead of ARNI. And finally, I mentioned ivabradine in people in sinus rhythm, despite maximal dose of people with sinus rhythm, beta blockers, maximally tolerated dose, heart rate above 70 is the indication to add ivabradine. But ivabradine is not a substitute for beta blocker. Beta blocker should be given titrated up, maximally tolerated dose, or you reach the maximum dose. If the heart rate is still more than 70, you can give ivabradine. This we know, CRT. Some people respond very well, as is shown here. And some new modalities like CCM, cardiac contractility modulation. The CCM signal applied during the absolute refractory period to the RV septum via standard pacing electrode. We have some data with omecamtiv mecarbil, which improves the myosin actin sliding because of the effect on the myosin. And we have vericiguat, directly stimulates the soluble guanylate cyclase. So these are the emerging drugs in heart failure. So let me conclude. We have 4 pillars of optimal heart failure with reduced ejection fraction medical therapy. The mighty 4 are the foundational 4. They are the ARNI or ACE inhibitor, beta blocker, SGLT2 inhibitor, and the MRI. In people who have congestion, use diabetic. And in someone with ejection fraction below 35%, you can consider ICD. Other things, sinus rhythm more than 70 beats per minute, consider ivabradine. LBBB, very wide QRS, consider CRT. You can consider other modalities, though the evidence may not be very strong, but certainly AF require anticoagulation. Cardiac contractility modulation, even now, is not a very, very standard recommendation. And never forget the anemia correction in heart failure. If serum ferritin is below 100 and with the transferrin saturation is below 20%, straight away ferric carboxymaltose. Then drugs like vericiguat, omecamtiv, then of course digoxin, though it is not high in the list now. People with functional MR, you can consider, mitral valve replacement or mitral clip and things like that. Then people with CKD, hydralazine isotropy dinitrate combination. So these are all the things available. And lastly, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. There is some light at the end of the tunnel. You have the Emperor Preserve trial telling it is useful. It is encouraging. And the people who are maximally benefited are women with comparatively low ejection fraction. Possible role for ARNI was shown in the Paragon HF trial. Possible role for spironolactone or eplerenone, the TOPCAP trial, especially if you are starting it relatively early. But the most important point, early recognition and treatment. Try to maintain the patient in sinus rhythm, early and optimum control of blood pressure and risk factors, maintaining optimum volume status. You should be able to identify heart failure in stage A and stage B. Stage A is just presence of risk factors like hypertension. You treat it properly, prevent the development of left ventricular hypertrophy so that they will not develop diastolic dysfunction. They will not develop perivascular fibrosis. The interstitium will remain normal so that they will not eventually develop heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Thank you very much for your listening.
Unmute करो.
हाँ, unmute कर दिया.
Thank you, Dr. Kosi, for a wonderful talk on the management of heart failure, how to manage subs and latest. Really, we are benefited. Your student, one of sitting here, Dr. Vinit, with me.
Very much thank you. Very much thank you. It's always
So
a great honor to listen you, sir.
Sir,
We are seeing you after a long time. Thank you.
like-
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vinny. Thank you.
thank you, Doctor.
Great opportunity to meet you all.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
have seen many of you for conferences, but good
Yes.
that I could
Thank you.
be a faculty in the prestigious cardiac conference of the Bihar CSI chapter. Thank you very much. Good night.
Now we move to next topic. Dr. G.S. Vander. Vander doesn't require any introduction. He is known both circle in cardiology and the API circle. He is member executive committee national CSI. He is going to speak on anti-thrombotic therapy. Dr. Vander, you are connected?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Welcome, sir. Dr. BP Singh here at Patna to welcome you.
Thank you, sir. Nice. Thank you. Thank you. Let me
So
share the screen, sir.
Yes, I saw you in Deepak Elvat topic. You were moderating the session.
Right, sir.
Okay, Dr. Vander, you can start.
Right. Thank you for this opportunity, and it is such a big honor for me to be participating in the Cardicon conference of the Bihar chapter. And I can see some of my close friends. Friends, we all know a lot of us are wearing masks, those who are in groups, because of the fact that last 1.5 years have been swept by COVID. And as cardiologists, we have often been called to look after these patients because initially it was thought to be a pulmonary disease, but we now know there are many cardiac issues. Patients have died suddenly. There is an element of myocarditis. Acute myocardial infarctions are occurring in these patients. Patients have had stroke, and a lot of biopsy data showed that these patients have pulmonary infarctions, large vessel infarction, small vessel infarction. And so some autopsy data from France showed that it is a different kind of ARDS, the adult respiratory distress syndrome that these people get. And so we have a whole lot of thrombotic complications which are in the arterial tree. As I said, they cause stroke, they cause acute myocardial infarction. And data by Sripal Bangalore from New York showed us that 50% of their patients who presented with STEMI had normal coronary arteries. So initially, at the initial part of this pandemic, people were hesitant in taking these patients to the cath lab. But as we gained confidence, these people, the CSI has also given guidelines for echocardiography, for acute management of STEMI in this situation. Venous thrombosis is a very important aspect of this particular disease. And people believe that pulmonary venous thromboembolism plays a big role in the pulmonary complications of this condition. We know there are micro and macrovascular complications in the pulmonary tree, in the cardiovascular, as also in the cerebrovascular tree. So there are a whole lot of thrombotic complications which happen because of a very significant endothelial dysfunction. There is a cytokine storm, we know, which occurs in this particular condition, which takes away a lot of these patients, which causes a pro-inflammatory, and that results in platelet activation and stasis. And so, in fact, this affects all the three components of the Virchow's triad, which includes that there is stasis. A lot of our patients are immobilized. They have LV dysfunction. There is a hypercoagulable state because of the cytokine storm and increased activation of IL-6 and IL-2, the tumor necrosis factor. And as I said, there is endothelial dysfunction because this virus enters through the ACE2 receptors, and the virus shedding ultimately results in hypoxemia and platelet activation. And so obviously a lot of agents have been tried in this particular disease, whole lot of antiviral drugs with none being very beneficial were initially used and then rejected. A lot of them were used in our country also. And I would say only a couple of agents, that is oxygen, supine proning, use of corticosteroids in patients who have hypoxemia, and now the two new monoclonal antibodies. These are only the agents which have been shown to be beneficial in COVID-19. But today we are here addressing the issue of this hypercoagulable state, which has resulted in so many thrombotic complications. And there is a great interest in seeing what causes this thrombotic complications, which component of the Virchow's triad is more responsible, and can we really alter this? This is a beautiful paper published in the British Medical Journal by our friends from the RG Kar Medical College next door to you from Bihar, from Bengal. And what they showed was that the coagulation parameters in COVID-19 are increased. The prothrombin time is increased. There is increased fibrinogen level amongst survivors as compared to non-survivors. And the D-dimers are more significantly increased in non-survivors as compared to the survivors. So we now realize at this stage, our present state of knowledge tells us that the venous and arterial thrombosis both are prevalent in this country. We are still looking for what is the optimal thromboprophylaxis, which is not yet established. There are multiple randomized trials which are going on and are trying to evaluate the best antithrombotic regimen. And our ongoing experience has actually helped us to design some of these trials. And I'll just actually discuss with you some of the trials that have been reported till now, and where do we stand with regards to our present level of knowledge. I would say a corollary from the antiviral drugs can be drawn to the antithrombotic agents also. And as I go along, one of the initial studies, the HASA COVID study, was a randomized open label phase 2 trial. Now, this particular study compared therapeutic enoxaparin with standard anticoagulant thromboprophylaxis dose of enoxaparin. The primary outcome was these were ICU admitted, sick, ventilated patients, you see. And they looked at the changes in the gas exchange over a period of time and how many patients could they wean off the ventilators. Now, this particular study did show that the therapeutic enoxaparin improved gas exchange over time, increased the ratio of liberation from mechanical ventilation, and it was felt that a larger trial was required. This was only a small trial, and this triggered actually a lot of interest because we also had a lot of autopsy studies also showing that these patients have ultimately thrombosis. Now, this is a very interesting study, the Inspiration randomized clinical trial. This is a trial of more than 500 patients in which an intermediate dose of enoxaparin, that is 1 milligram per kg daily, was compared with 40 milligrams of enoxaparin, the thromboprophylactic dose that we use. The primary outcome was a composite of venous arterial thrombosis, the need to use ECMO or mortality. That means we were looking at what is the level of complications that happen if we are able to counter this prothrombotic state which occurs in these people. And what we did realize was that intermediate dose enoxaparin are somewhat higher than the thromboprophylactic dose of 40 milligrams once a day did not make a significant difference. And we found this did not result in any significant difference between intermediate dose and prophylactic dose that we were using. COVID brought a lot of us, actually, the medical activism was there, and it brought a lot of scientific fraternity into cooperation and coordination. And this is actually a rare example in which 3 pivotal trials which were testing therapeutic dose, that is 1 milligram per kg body weight twice a day of enoxaparin as we use in acute coronary syndromes, versus the standard prophylactic anticoagulation. I was talking to you, the active 4A trial, the REMAP CAP trial, and the ATTACC trial. Now, this composite assessment of these 3 pivotal trials forced the data analysis and management board to pause actually enrollment because of the futility of the efficacy of this excessive dose or the therapeutic dose thromboprophylaxis. Sometimes we have pathological actually evidence that something is happening, but when it does not translate into therapeutic activism, and in fact it results in greater complications. And this is actually a news release from the National Institute of Health, the active trial of blood thinners enrollment. There is some non-medical language being used here because this is for the general public also. So these 3 trials were paused, and what we found was that these 3 international partners had come together in an unprecedented collaboration. So what we found was a multiple platform randomized control trial in which from 3 different countries, for rapidity of need of data that we had, these 3 large trials, the REMAP-CAP, the ACTIV-4 and the ATT-AC trials. Now these trials spanned over 4 continents. They had a common goal, as I said, to use full dose anticoagulation with enoxaparin versus the thromboprophylactic dose. And what we found was that these trials did not show any significant benefit. And so among critically ill COVID-19 patients requiring ICU support, the so to say the high set of patients, this therapeutic anticoagulation did not reduce the need for organ support. And these trials were funded by not drug companies, but by the National Institute of Heart Research, UK, the Medical Research Council of Australia, the Canadian Institute of Heart Research, and the NIH. So you can see the 4 most respected bodies of research looked at, did a multiple platform data. And so the therapeutic activism, which we thought at that time would translate into reduction of morbidity and mortality, actually did not translate into so. And so the American Society of Hematology suggests that prophylactic intensity is preferred over intermediate or therapeutic intensity because we do not have evidence as yet. Certainly all hospitalized patients with COVID-19 who are immobilized, they should be put on prophylactic dose of low molecular weight heparin. Now let's look at this ACTION trial. You all agree with me that a lot of D-dimer, actually COVID-19 has brought a new aspect of medical practice in our country where patients are getting investigations done on their own and then they don't know how to interpret them. And there is a huge panic. They will ring you up with CRP, D-dimer reports. You all know as cardiologists how much respect or how much positive value we attach to the D-dimers level positivity. Now, this is a huge trial from Brazil, which looked at oral rivaroxaban or subcutaneous enoxaparin, and it looked at a 30-day use of a post-discharge. A lot of patients have been put on rivaroxaban on a long-term basis for 3 to 6 weeks after discharge. But let us look at what the evidence-based medicine has for us. And this is a significant study published this year in the Lancet, the ACTION trial. And what this study of about 600 patients showed us is that the composite therapeutic thrombotic outcome was similar. The composite thrombotic outcome and death in the therapeutic anticoagulation against prophylactic anticoagulation that we have been talking was similar. Rate of hospitalization or rehospitalization was the same. So just as we had in-hospital use of only thromboprophylactic dose of low molecular weight heparin to be beneficial, patients who have very high D-dimer levels who are in the hospital, this kind of a therapeutic anticoagulation with rivaroxaban or enoxaparin and out of hospital post-discharge 30-day use of rivaroxaban did not result in any benefit in terms of these complications. And this is very familiar to all of you, the modified improved VTE risk score, which says if someone has had a previous ventricular, the venous thromboembolism, So, if there is a patient of thrombophilia, if there is limb paresis, stasis, cancer, ICU stay, complete immobilization, age more than 60. Now, these are standard actually indications for post-discharge anticoagulation. And so is true for patients of COVID-19. And if there is a score of more than 4, then you are justified in using post-discharge anticoagulation in your patients. Otherwise, actually, there is no evidence base today for using post-discharge anticoagulation. This is an excellent paper which I would refer you all to have a look at. This is published in the JACC this year, and it looks at all the recent randomized trials of antithrombotic therapy for patients with COVID-19. It's a state-of-art review by multiple experts actually. And what it shows is that there are a number of trials looking at heparin-based regimens with intermediate or full therapeutic intensity. Look at those outpatient trials admitted in the wards, ICU. Fibrinolytic therapy has been used in a couple of trials. There are 2 trials, one from AIIMS Rishikesh and another trial from a foreign country with use of altiplase. Both these trials have been negative. And so the dictum is, unless a CT angio shows large vessel thrombi, just as we normally do in pulmonary thromboembolism, there is no place for actually use of fibrinolytic therapy. DOACs have been used extensively, and look at the number 7, 6, and 2 in these post-discharge area. Also, DOACs have been used. Aspirin is being looked at in 3 trials in outpatients, 6 patients admitted in the ward, 6 trials in ICU setting, other anti. So there are a huge whole lot of trials still ongoing. Just to have a look at, I don't want to bother you with these names, but these are some of the trials which are ongoing. From this article you can make out, which is actually the latest article on this particular issue. So you will get, and this one which I actually colored is the trial which has actually been already released. So these are some of the trials which will be for patients in non-ICU setting. These are some of the ongoing trials in critically ill patients. The Inspiration trial is already released. All these trials are ongoing, and hopefully the third wave does not come, but if it does, then some of this data will be available. These are the post-discharge trials which are ongoing and the results of which will be out. This is the latest actually guidelines from the American Society of Hematology, which says that there is no data to support the measurement of coagulation markers, that is D-dimers, prothrombin time, platelet count, fibrinogen. So there is actually no place to increase the cost of treatment of our patients, because this is not shown to be of any benefit. In patients, there is no place for anticoagulation. Post-discharge patients, as yet, there is no evidence base for anticoagulants to be used unless we have documented DVT or we have documented large vessel embolic strokes. So use of these investigations is actually discouraged, and non-hospitalized patients with COVID-19, anticoagulants, antiplatelets should not be initiated. Patients who are receiving anticoagulant or antiplatelet therapies for some other indication, your cardiac patients who are on statins, who are on antiplatelets, who are on anticoagulants, it should definitely be continued in those subset of patients. Hospitalized non-pregnant adults with COVID-19, what we have evidence is to only use prophylactic dose anticoagulation in hospitalized patients. There is insufficient evidence to recommend either for or against the use of thrombolytics or higher than prophylactic dose at present in hospitalized patients. So just as the data we actually looked at, and hospitalized patients with COVID-19 should not routinely be discharged from the hospital while on VT prophylaxis, because there is no evidence at present. And friends, I would end here by saying that VTEs, venous thromboembolism secondary to COVID-19 has resulted in a higher mortality. We know vast majority of patients present with undiagnosed disease. Patients who are hospitalized, patients who are in the ICU, they should all be put on thromboprophylactic dose of low molecular weight heparin. where we have a definitive evidence of thromboembolism, rivaroxaban or apixaban can be used for post-discharge prophylaxis. So in one word, if I have to say, people have been depending hugely on the D-dimer test. I think it has been overutilized. It has only increased the cost of therapy. There is no evidence to date which shows that the use of this particular investigation added significantly. Also, thromboprophylactic dose should be used in all these people who are hospitalized, who are in the ICU, who are in the ventilators. But unless you have large vessel thrombosis on CT angiograms, there is no place for using therapeutic dose anticoagulation. Thank you.
For your masterly talk on the subject. Now you are wiser on the subject. Many anticoagulants with many doctors, many patients have consumed on our advice. If the unfortunately third wave comes, we will be wiser on the subject in prescribing this prophylactic anticoagulant and other antiplatelet therapy. Thank you, Dr. Wander. Thank you for your wonderful talk. Thank you.
May I say a few words?
Yeah.
Dr. Wander, sir.
Yeah.
You are most welcome. Myself, Dr. D.P. Singh.
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Nice to see you, sir. Very nice to
you
see
are
you.
most welcome. As your name is Dr. G.S. Wander, you are always wonderful. And the excellent talk, wonderful talk you have given us. You have enriched our knowledge. And this is the COVID time we are meeting. And so greetings from Silk City, Bhagalpur through this conference. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wander. The next speaker is Dhiman Kohli. Dr. Dhiman Kohli doesn't require any introduction. He's chairman of the National Intervention Council. And recently, Dr. Kohli, I want to congratulate you. I participated in it for successful organization of the National Intervention Council. Your colleagues are here. All we enjoyed the various topics and things. With these few words about Dr. Kohli, I invite you for your deliberation on management of acute myocardial infarction during COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Kohli, please. Dr. Kohli.
Thank you, Dr. D.P. Singh. I am very thankful to you, Dr. D.P. Singh, and all the dignitaries present over the dais for kindly inviting me to talk on such a prestigious meeting. And I have been watching the proceedings for a long time, and it's really wonderfully presented. An excellent meeting to tell, and also have been listening the excellent lectures by all our great cardiologists like Dr. Wander, Dr. Koshi, and others. So thank you very much, and thanks for the compliments given to our NIC meeting. It's our meeting. You are also a participant. Thanks, everybody. So today I have been assigned the job of talking on management of acute myocardial infarction during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are several documents now. We have got the ACC AHA document, the SKY document from our Cardiological Society of India. I am also a member of this committee, and also from the European Society of Cardiology and other societies. So there are several documents, and I just tried to summarize the documents so that when we get the patients, we can know what to do. An objective of the document is to provide recommendations for a systematic approach for the care of patients with an acute MI during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we know that STEMI patients need primary PCI. This is the best option. If possible, whether the patient has got COVID or no COVID, anytime, we know that primary PCI is the best option. Now, you can tell me, but it has been shown in many trials that pharmacoinvasive strategy is non-inferior to primary PCI. And we have our STEMI documents from India, from Cardiological Society of India again, and there we have also promoted because of the facts that in our country, many patients cannot go to a center, even if they have money, even if they know they come early, but they can't go for primary PCI because They are far away from the cath lab, 200 kilometers, sometimes 100 kilometers away from the cath lab, so it will take time. So we thrombolize them. So from the different society, cardiological society, IMA and API, we have been advocating that pharmacoinvasive strategy is the best strategy. Though we all personally believe that primary PCI is the best one. Why? Because we do the thrombolysis. We know that with streptokinase, the lysis rate is at 90 minutes is only 32%. And though it is double, that is 62 to 63% with Retiplase and Retiplase and Tenecteplase, Retiplase and Tenecteplase, we don't get the benefits being translated into mortality or morbidity data with the newer generation thrombolytics. So sometimes the artery is completely occluded, it doesn't open, and as a rule, the outcome is not good in those group of patients. So we always try to go for primary
Your
PCI.
slides are not changing. Your slides are not changing.
No, sir. Slides are, I have given to the slide mode. I can see the slide. We have given to the, the heading of this is STEMI patients, I'm just talking out of the slide, So STEMI patients, all STEMI patients should initially undergo evaluation in the emergency department. That's very vital. Patients should be evaluated in the ED prior to cath lab activation to ensure appropriate risks are assessed. This is very, very important in this pandemic time, and all patients require the placement of a face mask to prevent droplet contamination of the cardiac cath lab and environment prior to transport. That's very, very important that we should take all the precautions. We should examine the patient. We should have a thorough evaluation, quick but thorough evaluation regarding the status of, COVID. Because if we find that the patient is not going to survive, what's the use of taking him to the cath lab first and foremost? Because some of the patients are so ill that it is imminent that the patient is not going to survive. And in STEMI patients, primary PCI should remain the default strategy, as I was telling. In patients with clear evidence of STEMI, if primary PCI approach is not feasible, then of course, as we have been discussing, we go for the pharmacoinvasive approach. And during the COVID era, there may be delays in door to balloon times that results from evaluation time and or management of COVID-19 patients for other reasons. But one thing is very important, that we have to document it in the medical record. Then we are not at fault. Because there are so many medical legal cases nowadays, and the patient might tell, sir, you didn't took me within half an hour, we came immediately, and we did an delay of 1 hour or so. We shouldn't do. We normally don't do also. Even in this era, we take the patient, we are ready with the PPE, our cath lab is ready with the sisters, radiographer, everybody with PPE suit. We take the patient on the table and do our job. Now, regarding possible STEMI for patients who have an unclear or equivocal diagnosis of STEMI due to atypical symptoms, diffuse ST elevation, or sometimes atypical ECG findings, suppose complete LV, or a delayed presentation. Additional non-invasive evaluation should be done in the emergency department, like point of care ultrasound or echo. Normally is transthoracic echo. We put the probe, and within 2-3 minutes, we can see whether there is any regional wall motion abnormality. And the evaluation is for twofold: further risk stratification of COVID-19 status, that's very important, and further evaluation of the diagnosis, specifically assessing the potential for coronary thrombotic occlusion versus other pathologies. Like Dr. Wander was telling, that in 50% of the patient, our very good friend, Dr. Sripal Bangalore, has shown in his article in NEJM, that in 50% of the patient, there is no thrombosis or there is no significant occlusion in the infarct-related artery. So we should go for an echocardiogram after initial assessment by physical examination, ECG, and we should go for a TROP-T, not TROP-I, because TROP-I takes a lot of time. So TROP-T should be done. The result comes within 10 to 15 minutes, and we should try to do some imaging in the form of echo to have a decision between the ED physician and the interventionist, so that regarding the cath lab activation. And we should always have in our mind that the cath lab staff should be very safe and they shouldn't have the disease from the patient. And coronary CTO angio sometimes we consider from the findings of ST elevation and transthoracic echo if the data are divergent. Because if there is ST elevation, it sometimes occurs in COVID myocarditis. In that case, there may be global hypokinesia, but not regional wall motion abnormality. In those cases where we think it's not an MI, we can send the patient for a quick evaluation to the CT angiogram. Now, this is the algorithm which is practiced all over the world. Care for ST elevation on ECG at a primary PCI center. COVID-19, if it is positive or probable, symptoms consistent with myocardial infarction, ECG consistent with myocardial infarction, TROP-T positive. Of course, in myocarditis also TROP-T, TROP-I, CKMB, CK, everything is elevated, all the cardiac enzymes. We should consider an echo over our country and confirm any regional wall motion abnormality. And if we find after the initial evaluation, it's a clear-cut case of STEMI, we take it to the cath lab. And any equivocal symptoms, atypical ECG, echo to detect regional wall motion abnormality, serial ECG if needed, and portable chest X-ray if possible in all the suspected COVID cases to see the lung status and consider COVID-19 myocarditis. And then it's up to us to decide, or the cardiologist to decide that whether we should go for cath lab activation or not. If we suspect is a myocarditis, better to watch the patient. In case of NSTEMI also, if we find that the damage is not moved according to the criterion, we can wait for some time. But okay, if he is hemodynamically not stable, if the patient is LVF, we should take the patient. And in such cases, we put the patient to ventilator and then do our job in cases of severe heart failure and cardiogenic shock. We'll discuss about it later on at length. Now, regarding the patients who are possible candidates for COVID-19, symptoms consistent with MI, ECG consistent with MI, we diagnose STEMI, take the patient to the cath lab and go for primary PCI. Now, this is the management approach in the EMS field. Here, EMS means the referral center, and COVID-19 status unknown, emergency department evaluation for COVID-19 screening, and focused history is very important, whether the patient has got history of preceding fever, cough, etc., and good physical examination. Pulse oximeter gives good idea. Sometimes there is happy hypoxia. The patient is not that just symptomatic. He complains of only chest pain and some SOB, and the pulse oximeter shows oxygen saturation of 76%, and chest X-ray if possible. And consider COVID-19 myocarditis. In our case, ED and X-ray lab and everything is very close, so it's not difficult to organize everything. The echo comes to the ED and does it within 5 minutes time. And normally we take our patients even this during this period within 1 hour after coming to the hospital. Even stay COVID positive patients. Last week also I have done 2 cases and STEMI and COVID-19 positive or probable, take to the dedicated COVID-19 cath lab if possible. We haven't got any such lab, but we have a dedicated COVID lab in the sense that when it comes, we take all the patients to that lab, lab 3, not in 1 or 2 or other lab. And we do the job like a COVID positive patient, then we sanitize it and take it after fumigate the lab. And after that, we take non-COVID patients also after 7.5 to 2 hours. And universal use of PPE should be practiced. All the cath lab staff should have it for aerosolized and droplet precautions in STEMI patients. And in CCU also, we have a suspected CCU so that the suspected patients are there. And if it's a positive patient, we have a few rooms with negative pressure in the CCU. We place them in those rooms, isolated with glass doors, preferably. STEMI and COVID-19 possible, not positive or probable means it's a question mark. Standard STEMI care, they are telling that we can take this patient to non-COVID cath lab, but we don't take it. All our patients, suspected patient, because unless we are able to do ultra rapid COVID testing with about, kits, it's difficult because that gives an idea within 15 minutes, non-COVID cath lab, universal use of PP, but we take honestly all these patients, suspected patients, whether it's possible or positive, to our COVID cath lab and do the job. And we use universal PP and mask for all these patients. We put a good mask, surgical mask. We tie it because the preventive is around 70% with a surgical mask, which is tied, rather than which is around the ears. That's 50% protect. And care pathway for STEMI at referral hospital. That's very important in our country. Discussion with transfer hospital if possible. Consider pre-transfer fibrinolysis, because these are not difficult. If the doctor talks with us 24 hours, we hold a cell phone and we can have a talk and we can have a discussion whether the patient should be immediately thrombolized and what are the adjunct drugs which should be given if they request for it, of course. And COVID-19 risk screening should be done. And if it is positive again, and consider COVID-19 marker, it should be excluded. And if it's STEMI, please take the patient to the COVID lab. And if it is a far away, same protocol, fibrinolysis, pharmacoinvasive. What about the out of hospital cardiac arrest and cardiogenic shock patient? They are the highest risk patient of this AMI patient, and they are highest risk also for droplet-based spread of COVID-19 in this SARS-CoV-2 infection. Patients with resuscitated out of hospital cardiac arrest on the should be selectively considered for cath lab activation in the presence of persistent ST elevation on the ECG. Even the NSTEMI patient should be taken. And a concomitant wall motion abnormality in echo, regional wall motion, and we should treat the patient urgently as soon as possible. We should prioritize those patients. We recommend that OHCA patients without ST elevation, not routine early, of course, invasive approach, unless hemodynamic instability ensues. An acute coronary occlusion remains high on the differential diagnosis, and a multidisciplinary team should be active. Now, regarding COVID-19 positive or probable patients, MCS might be considered. In our hospital, it's IVP. We have an Impella. We have 1 or 2 ECMO, of course. And if required, we can put the patient venous extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which we call as ECMO, should be considered for severe pulmonary decompensation and failure to oxygenate. When feasible, bedside placement of MCS or ECMO might decrease the risk of exposure to the cath lab or cardiothoracic surgical team. The approach is dependent on local resources and the COVID-19 disease burden in the community. There are not enough data at this time to state whether advanced support devices for COVID-19 associated cardiovascular pathology will positively impact mortality rates, and thus individual patient risk assessment is required. Regarding personal protective equipment, CCL staff and physicians should have appropriate personal protective clothes, and for safe performance of the procedure, including gowns, gloves, full face mask, which should be N95 respiratory mask. And normally we put on top of that another surgical mask so the protection is complete. And we should be careful also while taking out the gowns. And we should remove it in that cath lab only. And we should keep all the leads and thyroid shield, everything in the cath lab to be fumigated later on. If N95 masks are to be reused between cases, then as I told, surgical masks should be put as a rule. The number of HCW present during the procedure should be limited to only those essential for patient care and procedure support. We shouldn't expose our active force, full active force in the lab. Only those who are absolutely essential. 1 radiographer, 1 sister helping us, and 1 floor manager sister who cares for the patient, whatever is required. Proper PPE training should be provided and practiced by physicians and CCL staff involved in all cases, and extra consideration should be given to the protection of trainees in high-risk patients and procedures. Patients with respiratory compromise should be intubated. We shouldn't delay, and prior to arrival in the cath lab if possible. If intubation is required in the cath lab, all persons should have complete PPE exposure should be minimized to essential team members only, as we have told. For all procedures at high risk of aerolization, PAPR should be considered. This we should keep in mind. And each regional STEMI system should update their system of care immediately to maximize patient and provider safety, including adequate PPE during transport and procedures for STEMI patients who are COVID-19 positive or probable. First medical contact to deperfusion time should be of paramount importance. And as we mentioned, it should be only 10 minutes as per the latest 2017 ESC guideline. So we shouldn't delay, and ACCHA till now tell it's 30 minutes, but according to ESC, because majority in the NIC data we have shown that all the patients, practically 40% of total cases, we thrombolize or reperfuse. 96% of the patients, 94% are thrombolized, and 6% only have primary PCI or pharmacoinvasive PCI. So practically 94% of our patients are thrombolized, and we should take care that we should thrombolize the patient urgently, because all the trial data, captive trial data, French registry, everything shows that if we thrombolize the patient as early as possible, especially within 1.5 to 2 hours, the outcome is even better than primary PCI. It is critical to ensure PPE and rapid sterilization procedures, and this should be prioritized throughout the entire system of care, and at each level it should be taken care. EMS, ED, CCL providers regarding the SARS-CoV-2 status. And emergency medical services should include a brief assessment of the COVID status, positive, probable, or possible, if possible, by a doctor, because now in many ambulances there is a doctor, and they can be in touch with us in the cath lab, and they can tell us that what is the status of the patient regarding the COVID infection. All transfer STEMI patients should be re-evaluated again in the primary PCI center ED. We shouldn't overcome it, and we shouldn't bypass the ED, and we shouldn't send them directly to the cath lab. Patients with STEMI at a referral hospital with established COVID-19 infection should be discussed prior to transfer to a PCI center. And here you see fibrinolysis within 30 minutes. It's the American, American advice, but ESC people tell us it should be within 10 minutes, which is very vital. And this is, just to tell that it doesn't exist in our country, regional system of STEMI care, but we have to make it in our settings, and all communities should create a regional system. And we should be in touch with our referring physicians that how to, I have many physicians who load the patient after STEMI. They give both aspirin, clopidogrel, 40 milligrams of Rosuva, or 80 milligrams of atorvastatin, and 5,000 heparin IV. So they're fully loaded, and many times, and I have a paper in CSI journal also, which shows that the lysis rate is as high as 75% with this procedure, much more than any of the recent thrombolytics. And performance of a 12-lead ECG, if possible, should be done after the first medical contact if the symptoms are consistent with STEMI, and we should take the patient for reperfusion therapy within 12 hours. And really, it's very dismal in our country, because the NIC data showed that only 40% of the patients are reperfused either pharmacologically or 6% with primary PCI. So more than 50% of the patients are not thrombolized, and this is not changing. In 2017 in Delhi NIC, we saw the same data. So anyhow, we have to make our people more aware. It has increased by only 4 to 5% reperfusion rate in our country. And primary PCI is the recommended method, as I told you. And if it is not possible, of course, we shouldn't miss fibrinolysis, and we should go for pharmacoinvasive. An immediate transfer to a PCI capable hospital for primary PCI is recommended, and the job should be done within 120 minutes. Normally, after, as I told, in our hospital, from ED to cath lab, door to balloon time is below 60 minutes, and we try to maintain it even in the COVID era, and all of us are doing, even we are much more aged than our younger colleagues, and all of us are doing this procedure wearing
Sir,
PPEs
can you
to
summarize your
celebrate.
talk?
Yeah. So primary should be, a PCI should be performed in patient if the ischemic symptoms are less than 12 hours and also between 12 to 24 hours. So there is a little bit of difference between the Europeans and the ACC. And they have also given the guideline that if the patient is symptomatic, we can go up to 48 hours. So if the patient has ongoing ischemic symptoms, then we can go up to 48 hours. And especially it should be performed in patients with STEMI and cardiogenic shock or acute severe heart failure, irrespective of the time delay from MI inset. Now, regarding the non-infarct artery intervention, it's a $1 million question. And as we know, nowadays we do the primary PCI of the infarct-related artery, and in the same setting, it's not in the same setting. If the patient is stable, we can go for it from the different data, from the different trials, but normally we don't go then and there, but before discharge, we go for it. But what we do in our setup, that for long we see that the patient needs another angioplasty package if we do it on a separate setting. So what we have been practicing for the last 20 years, if the patient is stable, we have been doing the non-infarct related artery as well, because it's our country, money is a big factor, and probably he will not be able to go for a second angioplasty. So it's our procedure of choice, and we have been practiced, and we didn't lose a single patient in our practice because of doing the non-infarct. And these are the various molecules if the thrombus load is very high. And in about 20% of the patients, as we saw in the NIC data, we have been using the GP2V3 inhibitors, and we give DAPT. Sometimes in these patients, we give,
Sorry to interrupt, sir. May I request you to
and aspirin. Yeah, I have finished. Just give me 1 minute time, please. And this is a 62-year-old gentleman, smoker, non-diabetic, normotensive, and the patient came to ED, and immediately this patient has received by my referral doctor. He's also a MD cardiologist, and he has given the combination of heparin also. And just see, this is the left-sided arteries. These are all okay. This is the right-sided. The artery has opened, and there is TIMI3 flow in it. And even after opening the artery, good TIMI3 flow occurs. And normally we go for direct stenting. Just I would advise my junior colleagues or PGTs that don't go for P-dilatation if possible, and try to give a long duration dilatation and a single one. And we should give some Nicorandil IV injection so that there is no flow or slow flow phenomenon. So to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, see the flow, beautiful TIMI3 flow, and we should also see at the myocyte perfusion, that is the blush, the myocardial blush. You see there is TIMI3 flush, and the patient ST segment elevation came down in the cath lab. You can see in the monitor, and we must watch for it because it should be a prolonged injection. We should give minimum of diasmy as much as possible, but you can see the beautiful blush over there, because if there is TIMI3 flow, that indicates there is 50% ST resolution, there is TIMI3 flow. But if there is 70% plus resolution, it shows TIMI3 flow, good epicardial flow, along with good blush. So thank you very much for your time and patience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir, for your fantastic lecture. You have almost covered all important aspects of primary PCI in COVID era. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Now we move on to the next lecture, since we are running behind our schedules. Our next speaker is Dr. Ravi Vishnu Prasad. Dr. Ravi, have you joined?
Yes, sir.
He will be speaking on cardiovascular manifestation in COVID patient. May I request you to finish your talk in 15 minutes time, Dr. Ravi Vishnu?
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I will congratulate the organizing committee for conducting such a wonderful academic conference. And it is my pleasure to be part of this. and the task given by organizing committee to talk about the cardiovascular manifestations in COVID patient. I would start the talk with my one case. This was the case history of 56 years old male who was admitted with the shortness of breath and recurrent syncopal attack for last 1 month, and ECG shows a complete heart block. He was put on TPI in the emergency department. This was the X-ray which shows the cardiomegaly with the LV type of apex, and the echo shows that all the cardiac chambers were dilated with a severe dysfunction, and the LAD was mildly hypokinetic. And the follow-up ECG was done with everyday ECG was done, and second degree AV block, then the sinus rhythm was achieved, and the TPI was removed. So the patient was planned for the coronary angiography, and the coronary angiography shows the normal coronaries. So in view of dramatic improvement in the symptoms, ECG, echo findings, the suspicion of myocarditis was made, and the COVID antibodies were highly raised. So the diagnosis was made, the COVID-19 myocarditis with the inflammatory DCMP, and the patient still comes in the OPD and he's recovering better, and the echo, the EF is improving day by day. So we are basically residing in the COVID-19 pandemic. As you all know, this is the virus which is caused by the 7th virus caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the first case was reported in December 2019 in the Wuhan district of the China. So the cardiovascular manifestations of the COVID vaccine, COVID infection, it has a wide spectrum of cardiovascular manifestations ranging from subtle myocardial injury to the cardiogenic shock. Why this occurs? The SARS-CoV-2 basically preferentially infects the lungs and the respiratory tract like the other respiratory viruses, but due to its broad tissue tropism, it has also causes a diverse range of extrapulmonary manifestation involving the cardiovascular system, the neurological system, which will manifest as the stroke, the seizures. It involves the gastrointestinal system, and even the diarrhea and the liver damage has been reported. Also, the renal involvement is there, and it causes the renal dysfunction. So basically, the manifestation can be either the upfront or after the resolution of the symptoms of the LRTI. And these cardiovascular manifestations are more common in elderly patients and the patients having the comorbid conditions like hypertension, diabetes, prior CVD, obesity, or the CHF. Now coming to the how it affects the cardiovascular system, there is a relationship between the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptors are predominantly present in the type 2 pneumocytes, cardiac myocytes, kidneys, endothelial cells, and all the pericytes. Even the genetic study which were done in the last month, it shown that the ACE2 inhibitors are the maximum concentration of ACE2 receptors are present in the cardiac myocyte. As you all know, the S protein of the SARS-CoV virus attaches with the ACE2 receptors through the help of the TMPRSS2. And when the virus enters into the host cell, it starts replicating and there is a destruction of ACE2 molecule. As you all know, the ACE2 molecules, they helps in degrading the angiotensin 2 molecule, which is a part of the RAS system. And you all know that this ACE2 angiotensin is basically it causes the inflammation, cell proliferation, and vasoconstriction and fibrosis, and ultimately leading to the myocardial injury. And this ACE2 molecule is basically the anti-inflammatory molecule, anti-hypertrophic. It causes the vasodilation and the antifibrotic. So due to the down regulation of the ACE2 molecule, there is an increased level of the angiotensin, and which causes all type of the myocyte injury. Now, if you once the patient is on the ACE inhibitors or the ARB inhibitor, whether we should stop this molecule or not, the answer is no. All the guidelines recommend that we should continue the ACE inhibitors or the ARBs, because This ACE inhibitors, they act on the ACE molecule, ACE enzyme, which has been converting the angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, while this COVID virus acts on the ACE2 molecule. So the mechanism is entirely different. Now, coming to the mechanism of the myocardial injury in the COVID-19 patient, the causes are multifactorial. The first one is the direct viral injury. It is, although it is less common, it is more common when the lungs are involved. Basically, due to the immunological response of the virus, there is a cytokine storm, as Dr. Wander has said. There is an increased level of interleukins, the TNF factors, and the metalloproteinase. And also, I told that there is down regulation of ACE2 expression in the myocytes. And due to the hypoxia, it may be also one of the cause of the myocardial injury. And the various drugs which are used in the COVID patient, like the antiviral therapy, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, remdesivir, and the monoclonal, they are the cytotoxic, and the hydroxychloroquine and the azithromycin, it increases the QT interval. Now, this is the simplified way of the pathophysiology of myocardial injury. There is a direct cardiotoxicity, hypoxia-mediated injury, there is supply-demand mismatch, there is cytokine storm, and there is DIC. And this leads to the acute coronary syndrome, arrhythmia, myocarditis, venous thromboembolism, and the heart failure. This is the flow chart. We saw that it has a pan-cardiovascular syndrome in every part of the cardiovascular system involved, either the acute coronary syndrome in the form of STEMI or the non-STEMI, or the acute myocardial injury without obstructive CAD, arrhythmias and the conduction blocks are noted, heart block with or without cardiogenic shock is noted, pericardial effusion and tamponade has been reported, and also the thromboembolic complication in the form of venous thromboembolism and the pulmonary embolism have been noted in the COVID patients. Also, due to the stress, the incidence of stress cardiomyopathy has been increased. Now, coming to the epidemiology, this is the slide showing the epidemiology of the various percentage. The percentage of there are various case reports. There is no definite data how the percentage, how much myocardial injury and how the arrhythmias and how much heart failure are involved. Because there is no scientific data on this. Only the case reports have been published till now. Now, coming to the first cardiovascular manifestation, the acute coronary syndrome. The COVID-19 can trigger the ACS. The mechanism, as I told, it is a plaque rupture, coronary spasm, or the macrothrombosis due to the systemic inflammation or the cytokine storm, and really the direct invasion, and the stimulation of the macrophages, endothelial and the smooth muscle cells. The stimulation of macrophages, they release the collagenases, which decreases the level of the collagen in the plaque, and also it releases tissue necrosis factor, which decreases the plaque erosion. So in the acute MI in the COVID-19, the both types have been reported. You know well about the type 2. It is basically the supply-demand mismatch, which may be due to the hypoxemia, hypoperfusion, or the hemodynamic instability. Also the type 1, which is basically due to the plaque rupture due to the systemic inflammation. They all lead to the acute myocardial injury and the ECG changes and the troponin level elevation. So the cardiac markers, they are commonly involved more is raised due to the direct myocardial injury and also due to the type 2 myocardial infarction. The important point is that the troponin should be measured only if the diagnosis of MI is being considered on the clinical grounds, and casually ordered abnormal should be disregarded, as told by Dr. Dhiman Kahli sir also. There is a linear relationship between the levels of the cardiac troponin level and the mortality in the COVID-19. As the cardiac troponin level increases, the mortality also increases. The ECG findings, it is same as the other general population. So routine use of echo, TMT, or imaging should be avoided, and only imaging should be performed when it is contributing to diagnosis and the management. Now, this is the flow chart. Once the patient is having the arrives in the ER, put the surgical face mask, put all the precautions, troponins and HS, CRP proteins have been ordered, ECG, and screening for the COVID and do for the HRCT. HRCT is very important because there is a quadruple rule out. Any patient with coming to the dyspnea and the chest pain, if positive for the, we have to rule out the three. If we do the CT, then we rule out the 4 diseases like pneumonia, pulmonary embolism, myocarditis, and the acute coronary syndrome. This is the publication. When the patient present with the ACL, they have a high thrombus burden and they usually present with the multivessel thrombosis. And this multivessel thrombosis, there is an increased chance of stent thrombosis, increased use of GB2B inhibitors, and there is increased use of thromboaspiration, and which is due to the systemic inflammation due to the cytokine storm. And there is also the elevated levels of the D dimers and the interleukin levels also. This was the case which was admitted in our hospital on 9 June in the second wave of the lockdown, and then lockdown period with the complaint of chest pain and dyspnea. This was the classical anterior MI with tombstoning pattern, and he was taken in the isolation ICU and thrombolized with the retiplase and without waiting for the RT-PCR COVID status. This was the. And after after confirming the COVID negative status, he was shifted to the CCU, managed conservatively for the 3 days, and the PCI was done for the day 4. And this was the mid-LAD lesion and tight lesion, and also the diagonal was involved. So the 2 wires were put. And the mid-LAD was stented with the distal TB3 flow. Also, the second in the cardiovascular manifestation is the myocarditis. As you all know, the myocarditis is the well-known recognized complication of any acute viral infection. There are several cases reported. There is increase in the troponin and anti-proBNP report, and they usually present is the acute presentation. And also the fulminant myocarditis has been reported, and it can present after the complete resolution of the symptoms at DCMP, as I told earlier in the slide as a case, as I presented the case. And the cardiac MRI is the ideal non-invasive invasive tool. And the myocarditis should always suspected when any patient who come with the chest pain, ST segment changes, cardiac arrhythmia is there, patient present with the hemodynamic instability, then echo-wise, if the permit, the LV dilation, global or multi-segmental LV hypochondria is present, and there is a significant increase in the cardiac troponin and the BNP levels. This is the cardiac CMR picture, beautiful picture. It shows the biventricular myocardial interstitial edema bilaterally and in the both ventricles, and the diffuse transluminal late gadolinium enhancement and the pericardial diffusion. This is the ground glass opacity in the lungs. Also, the Takotsubo syndrome has been reported. It is due because of the both intense emotional stress and systemic inflammation, and also the reverse Takotsubo syndrome is reported also, where there is a basal hypokinesia for basal ballooning, reverse of this syndrome. Now, this was the case. This was 63 years male, which admitted with the COVID-19 pneumonia with the cardiac symptom. All the biomarkers were elevated. Troponin and IL-6, and the ECG shows the sinus tachycardia with no ST segment elevation. This was the X-ray on the first day, and the CT was done, which was show the typical ground glass appearance of the viral pneumonia. The patient was put on the, and this was the echo, which was initially shows the dilated cardiomyopathy, dilated LV, and the reduced ejection fraction. And after the 3 weeks, there was a considerable improvement in the LVEF and the return and the wall thickness. So the patient was diagnosed as a fulminant myocarditis. He was put on the antiviral therapy, corticosteroids, and mechanical life support. All the biomarkers have been reduced to the normal level, and ECG normalized to the normal sinus rhythm, and EF was also recovered to normal range. So we have to rule out the acute myocarditis versus the STEMI MI. This should be, we know, from the ST elevation, what is in the myocarditis and what is in the this STEMI. Third portion is the heart failure. Heart failure, the acute heart failure, the various prevalence rate is around 4 to 23%, and the usual cause is the myocardial ischemia, myocarditis, and the tachyarrhythmia. It is more commonly seen in the patients with having comorbid conditions like old age, CAD, hypertension, diabetic, and it may be the exacerbation of a chronic heart disease, and also we have to differentiate from the ARDS. Also in this, the last wave, we have seen the heart failure mostly in the older patients who have the various comorbid conditions, have a decreased cardiac reserve and the structural heart disease. While in the second wave, we have seen the heart failure in the young patients and the patient presenting basically with the primary myocarditis. So management of heart failure is as per standard protocol. As I told earlier, the patient already on the ACE inhibitors, ARB, they should be continued, but not discontinued. Arrhythmias, various types of arrhythmias have been noted in the COVID patients, and all types of conduction blocks have been noted. And this is basically due to the hyperinflammation, basically from the cytokine storm, and all the atrial fibrillation, AV blocks, VTVF have been reported, and also the sudden cardiac death has been reported in 20% of the cases. And also important is that this is basically the arrhythmogenic effects of the various drugs which we used, like lopinavir, which was initially used, or even with the hydroxychloroquine or the azithromycin, which causes the QT prolongation, which may cause the arrhythmias. So this was the case in which the SA node dysfunction, this was reported in this JAG study. Even the SA node is also found in the COVID patients. Patient with the COVID-19 pneumonia experienced the episode of systole accompanied by the hypertension, and ECG shows the pause of around 4.8 seconds. And once the reversible cause were excluded, the patient put on the pacemaker. This is the case of AV node dysfunction. The 49 years male with the who tested for the COVID-19, positive for the COVID-19. All the biomarkers and the echo findings were normal. ECG shows the bradycardia with the intermittent high degree AV block. The patient was followed up and he improved his symptoms, and ECG were normalized to the normal sinus rhythm. This was a classical case which was reported in the European Heart Journal. Even the Brugada-like pattern is also found in this COVID patient. You see the V1, the classical type 1 Brugada is there. And this was due to the authors concluded that this was due to the cytokine flux or the direct cardiotoxicity of the virus. Pericarditis is a very common, detection found in the bedside echo, but there is no data about what is the prevalence, and we have to keep that differential diagnosis about the chest pain, because sometimes it can cause the cardiac tamponade, which is the catastrophic if we can't pericardiocentesis. This is the case of the pericardial tamponade. You see the pericardial tamponade was treated well with just like a standard protocol. And the various population notice and pulmonary noted as told by Dr. Wander sir. And this may be due to the increased D-dimer levels, reduced platelet counts, and the prolonged thrombin time. And there is also the increased level of the fibrinogen factor 7, which ultimately leads to the DVT and the pulmonary embolism.
Dr. Ravi, please conclude the talk. We are running short of time. Already.
Okay, the sudden death in the COVID-19, around 20%, we should be always, the cause may be the hypoxic respiratory failure, demand ischemia, pulmonary embolism, cardiac shock, myocarditis, and arrhythmias. Also, the Kawasaki disease has been noted post-COVID. This is very important in this era. To summarize, COVID-19 primarily involves the respiratory system with the viral pneumonia as a predominant manifestation, and due to the broad tissue tropism, the various cardiovascular and the extra pulmonary manifestations which increase the morbidities are noted, and these are more common in the patient with having already the cardiovascular diseases and risk factor, and the mechanism is the direct invasion of the virus or the cytokine storm, and it requires a more better understanding about what is the correlation between the cardiovascular manifestation and the COVID infection. Thank you for patience hearing.
Talk, Dr. Ravi. Wonderful talk. And then you have shown the very, very, very rare cases. This COVID-19 can present as the protein manifestation of right CHV to myocarditis to heart failure. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker, Bharti.
We are running short of time, and the Dr. Prem Ranjan Singh is waiting for last 1 hour. He is my friend and son of soil of Bihar. He has a big experience in doing the peripheral and coronary work and doing multiple jobs in America. And he's a great experience in management of the pulmonary embolism cases. And he will present the topic of pulmonary embolism global crisis. Dr. Prem.
See my slide?
Okay, doctor, next. Thank you, Bolesh. Sir, now we move on to the last speaker, Dr. Manmohan. Dr. Manmohan?
Yes, sir.
Yes, he is a senior cardiac.
Yes, sir.
He's a senior cardiac surgeon at Patna, and he is very experienced cardiac surgeon. So, and now I request Manmohan, please go ahead.
Sir?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Arvind, sir? Yeah.
sir.
So, yeah, in the last, after getting exhausted with the this technical glitch, I'm starting my presentation with valve surgery. In short, just there are 4 valves in the heart: the mitral, aortic, tricuspid, and pulmonary. As a surgeon, we have to, deal with this. We have to deal with these 4 valves, and mitral is the most common valve. And why I'm dealing here with the structural valve, because the mitral valve is bicuspid, and the other 3 valves have 3 leaflets. During surgery, we have to excise the valve. We have to see the structure behind and below the valve. So the structural description is very much necessary from the surgical point of view. When we see the valves which are separating the atria and ventricle, the mitral and tricuspid valve, these valves are having a structural similarity because they are being supported by the chordae and the papillary muscle, which are tethered with the ventricular muscles. Actually, during cardiac contraction and relaxation, during cardiac movement, both these valves along with the annulus moves, and they are having they have to bear stress from both sides during the passage of the blood and during the isovolumetric contraction of the ventricle. So these two valves are having a different structure from the aortic and pulmonary, and the aortic pulmonary valves are having 3 cup-like structure, and these cup-like structure opens towards the data arteries. So when the blood ejects, it collapses along the side of the great valves, great arteries, and then when the blood during gastro, when the blood goes back from the aorta or pulmonary artery towards the ventricle, they cup filled up and they co-opt with each other, and the blood is prevented from going back from the pulmonary artery or aorta to the ventricle. Here you can see that this is just showing the structural similarity. This is the tricuspid valve, this is mitral valve. You can see that they are being supported with the chordae. And here, this is the aortic valve, which is unsupported. Similarly, here is the pulmonary valve, which is also unsupported by the ventricle. This video play, is it? Anyway, this video is not playing. It was a limited video just to show that how the structures, how the valves function. Again, coming to the anatomy. While doing this aortic valve, we have to see the important structure below the cusp, free cusp. Here is the AV node. Here is this mitral leaflet. So while excising it, we have to take care of this. So much debridement or much of the removal of the mass from here will damage this AV node, and there will be requirement of the permanent pacemaker. Similarly, while excising this part, that is the mitral leaflet, anterior mitral leaflet. If you go more ahead, you can take stitches along this aortic valve, and there will be aortic regurgitation during replacement of the mitral valve. Here we can see this is the coronary ostia, and while sitting the valve in the aortic valve, we have to take care of this coronary ostia. Here we can see that the circumflex artery on the posterior annulus of the mitral valve. Here again we can see that while taking the stitches on the posterior annulus, we have to take care of the circumflex artery. This picture depicts the anterior and posterior leaflets along with the chordae and the papillary muscle. While excising it, we should not go much near to the base of the papillary muscle, otherwise there will be ventricular damage. Similarly, while excising the anterior, while replacing the valve, we take care of this posterior leaflet so that much of the caudal preservation can be done to restore the ventricular functional activity in the post-operative period. So the function of the valve. So the function of the valve is the unidirectional flow. What happens today when the pathology sets in, whether it is inflammatory, infective, or congenital? There will be leakage of the valve or there will be stenosis of the valve. In case of the leakage, there will be volume overload to which of the chamber of the heart is getting a leakage. And in stenosis, the valve, the chamber which is behind the valve will be having a high pressure hypertrophy, and these are the entity that is mitral regurgitation, tricuspid regurgitation, according to the frequency of the involvement. Similarly, the mitral stenosis, aortic stenosis, pulmonary stenosis, and the tricuspid stenosis. Yeah, here we can see that how the volume, in case of the volume regurgitation, how this LV is getting loaded with the volume, and they usually get dilated. They get dilated, and while taking the care of the valve during the valvular surgery, we must see the dimension of the LV, how much it is, that will affect our post-operative result. Next is this. Here is this is the cardiological entity, but just to say that the gradient of the valve used to be 0. Here the gradient across the mitral valve is 34, and that leads to the atrial dilatation and atrial fibrosis like that. Now the next. So, from the surgeon point of view, I will advise that if these are the two ECG. One ECG is the sinus rhythm, another ECG is the atrial fibrillation showing the RV dominance. See, if this patient comes for the surgery, the result will be better. If this patient comes for the surgery with the mitral stenosis, or if it's mitral regurgitation, surgery, the result will be very poor, because even after removal, even after replacement of the valve, what will happen? The atrial kick will be lost, and the atrial fibrosis, and it will never get returned to the normal sinus. So we should take care of this, and while referring the patient for the surgical, better to send the patient a sinus rhythm so that the longevity of the operation should be maintained. How the valve looks during surgery. there is thickening, there is fibrosis, there is calcification, sometimes it gets perforated, either due to the infective endocarditis or during BMV, there heal vegetation, and sometimes on many times below the valve, below the mitral valve, there is some severe subvalvular clotting. This is an interesting case where during the surgery, initially the diagnosis was severe aortic degradation. While operating the patient, when we opened the valve, we got that this part of the valve, that is the just below the left coronary cusp, there was a big hole that filled with the clot and debris. You can see that this side was there. So this is the case of the annular abscess, subannular abscess. We have to maintain the entity, maintain the continuity or integrity of the valve, annulus, and the ventricle. I covered this area with the pericardial patch, and then the valve was put in. So it is one of the, you can say that the nightmare when without knowing that, without knowing it, and when you go in the OT, and we are simply thinking that we have to just replace the valve and get a subannular abscess. Just to show that it was below the left coronary cusp, you can see that this area and the left coronary ostia and the ventricular muscle. So we have to take care of this structure. Otherwise, this patient should have not survived. Okay. So what we do, what the surgeon do while operating? We do the valve replacement according to the selection of the orifice, the aortic valve mitral, most commonly. We do the valve repair if there is a possibility by doing the caudal elongation or making the myocardium. We do the valve surgery with the complexity, bicuspid aortic valve, LA reduction, CABG, aneurysm repair, double valve surgery, triple valve surgery, and the congenital surgery. The options we are having is the mechanical valve and the bioprosthesis. Mechanical valve always have a, there is always a requirement of the anticoagulation. Here we can skip off this anticoagulation. We have also got some sutureless valve bioprosthesis. Here we, without using the suture, the valve is being seated very easily. So there is some easier way of doing surgery. What we keep minding while operating, we do the myocardial preservation using cardioplegia and repeating it every 20 minutes if we are doing the solid place, preserving cardiac anatomy in best possible way for the post-operative outcome. Largest possible valve used to fill out paravalvularly so that the degradation of the LV or the gradient should be less, and keeping the mind in anticoagulation and longevity of the valve. So these were mechanical valves. This valve is obsolete, but the single-lifted and biliquid valves are available. You can see that the tissue valve, the orifice area is much larger than when compared to the mechanical valve.
Dr. Manmohan?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Since
We all are here, sir.
We are here just waiting to conclude your talk in next couple of minutes.
Yes, sir. Just finishing. If it plays, it's okay. Otherwise,
Okay.
just have a look.
We can conclude. Conclude video. It's very long.
Our technical
Yeah.
support, sir, requesting, technical persons are requesting, it's now
Yeah.
10 p.m. onwards. So you are
Yeah.
our family, you are our family. If you don't mind, you can conclude.
No, no, sir. Never mind, sir. It's my privilege. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Manmohan
thank
sir.
you. We are
Thank
so
you.
grateful for your
Patience.
kind gestures. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.